Hi, my name is Christian Sheridan, Associate Professor of English here at Bridgewater, and I also currently serve as the Chair of the Department of English at the college. I'm going to talk today about one of my current research interests, which also happens to be the topic of one of my favorite classes to teach: outlaws of the medieval period and the stories that are told about them. Now, when people think of medieval outlaws, they of course first think of Robin Hood. In fact, the image behind me is of a statue of Robin Hood from Nottingham, England. And Robin Hood is actually a major tourist attraction for the area. So, fascination with Robin Hood and outlaws in general remains high throughout the world. And I will be focusing on this most famous of outlaws later in my talk. But before that, I wanted to discuss briefly some of the earlier outlaws of medieval legend who probably influenced the Robin Hood stories as a way to begin to answer the question: where did the Robin Hood legend come from? First, some background on outlaws. Outlawing, that is, being declared an outlaw, is originally a legal category. In a society like medieval England, without a fully functioning legal and police system, there was little way for the authorities to compel criminals to appear in court to face charges unless those criminals were already in custody. The solution to this dilemma was to declare the criminal an outlaw. That is, being outside the law's protection. In practice, this meant any property the outlaw owned could be seized, and any protection against violence the law might have provided wasn't extended to someone who'd been named an outlaw. To understand what that means, we might think of one of the colloquial ways used to describe an outlaw. Outlaws in medieval England were said to wear the wolf's head. That is, to have the same status as wolves in England, vermin who could be hunted and killed with impunity. Outlawing could also be used as a political tool. A monarch might outlaw a fractious noble to get him to toe the line, and if the troublesome noble then eventually did fall back into line, he could be inlawed. That's the actual term, inlawed, and returned to the monarch's good graces. When outlaw tales and songs begin to circulate in the early Middle Ages, the majority of them focus on these upper class political outlaws, and they were often based on verifiably historical people. Tales such as the outlawry of Earl Godwin, the deeds of Herod, Eustace the Monk, Fulk Fitzwarren, all of these are based on real people who were in fact upper class men who were outlawed for political reasons. Now, these early outlaw tales share many motifs in common with the later Robin Hood tales and ballads, but they have a very different feel and are certainly very different from the Robin Hood most of us know from contemporary film and TV depictions. These early outlaws are more likely to fight dragons and giants, perhaps rescuing the odd damsel along the way, as they are to steal from the rich in order to help the poor. That being said, many of the incidents we associate with the Robin Hood legend can be found in these earlier tales, including finding refuge in the forest, assembling a loyal band of men, although this band wasn't always quite as merry as we might think, using disguises and ambushes against their enemies, and often having a loyal sidekick who's nearly the equal of the outlaw himself. Now, if you're interested in reading any of these early outlaw tales, there's an excellent edition of them in translation, all edited by Thomas Olgren. I'll have some bibliographical information on this and other resources for medieval outlaws in general, and Robin Hood in particular, at the end of the talk. So now let's turn to Robin Hood. Let me start by addressing the question of historicity. In other words, was there ever a real Robin Hood? And I have to say that it's very, very, very unlikely that there ever was a real Robin Hood. There are several Robin or Robert, Robin after all is short for Robert Hoods who are recorded. And some even seem to have been outlaws. Now, I should caution us here that by the time Robin Hood's name appears in the record, it had become a cliche for somebody who was outside the law. So chances are probably good, even the historically verifiable Robin Hoods may be taking their names as a kind of nom de guerre once they turned to a life of crime. So these historical figures, none of them provide a clear-cut candidate as the basis for our outlaws we have them. Rather, it's much more likely that the Robin Hood legend grew out of a popular culture tradition that I will briefly trace here. The earliest mentions of Robin Hood are not literary, but legal and pseudo historical. The legal examples involve the use of the phrase, and Robin Hood in Greenwood stood, in court records. This phrase is used to when the speaker is trying to imply that something is so obvious it doesn't even need to be said. It's kind of the equivalent of somebody saying, yeah, and the sky is blue. Tell me something I don't know. Um, the phrase appears in the records as early as the 13th century, and such an early appearance in legal documents suggests that stories about Robin Hood were already circulating, and circulating widely enough that it could be used as a cliche, even though no literary written texts survive from that period. The earliest literary record comes from the late 14th century, when a poet named William Langland invokes Robin Hood to criticize a priest. This priest, Langland tells us, knows stories about Robin Hood better than he knows the prayers he's supposed to say during Mass. This allusion, again, implies that stories about Robin Hood were circulating widely, but none survive in the literary record until the end of the 15th century, so nearly 100 years later. In between the mention in Langland's poem and the extant literary text are some pseudo historical chronicles of the early 15th century. These chronicles, in retelling various historical events with varying degrees of accuracy, mention Robin Hood in passing. For example, the earliest surviving chronicle, which dates from around 1420, notes that Little John and Robin Hood were outlaws, praised as good in Burnsdale and Inglewood. But it provides no more detail than that. Here again, we have a casual mention of the names, which suggests that the author of the chronicle was confident that his audience was familiar enough with the names of these particular outlaws that he didn't have to go into great detail. Now, before turning to the literary text, there's one more space in which the Robin Hood legend flourished that I need to mention. These are the play games of late medieval English parishes. A play game was a cross between a pageant or mobile party, a drama, and a fundraising drive, and often it seems with a fair bit of heavy drinking thrown in for good measure. Now, there are no good written records that survive, but it appears as if at certain times of year, the citizens of the parish would put together a moving pageant or play in which characters such as Robin Hood, Little John, Friar Tuck, at times even Maid Marian, would travel around the countryside performing skits or dances and asking, or it seems often at times outright demanding, people give them money as donations. So again, this is all kind of circumstantial. We don't have a script, as it were, of any of these play games, but in them we can see elements that are associated closely with the Robin Hood legend, the link to the natural world, and especially the transfer of money from those who have it to those who might need it more. Now, this last point, which I think today we come to think of as stealing from the rich to give to the poor, doesn't appear in any of the early Robin Hood texts. The late 15th century and early 16th century ballads, such as Robin Hood and the Monk or Robin Hood and the Potter, any robbery that the outlaws commit in these stories is for their own benefit, not to aid people in need. In perhaps the greatest and certainly the longest of the early texts, a jest of Robin Hood, Robin does indeed bestow largesse on a poor down on his luck knight, but a knight is not a starving peasant or a hard up villager. In other words, the motif of stealing from the rich to give to the poor is not part of the original medieval tradition and is in fact a much later addition to the legend. Also missing from these early texts is Maid Marian. Now, she may have made an appearance as a character in some of the play games, but in the literary text, she doesn't make an appearance until the late 16th century. During this period, the end of the Elizabethan era, when a playwright named Anthony Mundy writes a pair of plays about Robin Hood. Mundy introduces Marian, a key figure in the later legend, but he introduces another important change. Before this, Robin Hood has been a yeoman. A yeoman is a freeborn commoner of a class above a peasant, probably owned some land, could have been somewhat wealthy, but importantly, not an aristocrat. Mundy's Robin Hood is not a yeoman, but a nobleman. He becomes Robin of Locksley, a disgraced and displaced nobleman. Again, very familiar to us if you've seen any of the modern versions of the Robin Hood story. And as a nobleman, Robin Hood has a significant interest in producing an heir and thus needs a love interest of a suitably high class. It is this dynastic imperative, as much as anything else, that leads to the introduction of Marian into the literature about Robin Hood. And once again, we see that an aspect central to the way we as moderns understand the Robin Hood story is a post-medieval edition. The non-noble Robin Hood, the Robin Hood of the forest, the yeoman Robin Hood, continues to flourish in a vigorous broadside ballad tradition, often taking motifs from the earliest texts and reworking them right through the end of the 18th century. Now, many of these ballads are of great interest, but they really lie beyond the scope of this talk. And it's with Munday's plays in the late 16th century that the parameters of the modern Robin Hood story have been set. So modern writers and of course filmmakers, TV producers, etc., all draw not only on Monday's version, but on the many varied representations of Robin Hood that appear in the ballad tradition. And it is this malleability of his character, at times a poor commoner, at others a displaced noble, at once a thief and a scoundrel, but also a hero for the downtrodden. This ability to fill many roles, it is this ability that makes the Robin Hood legend continue to fascinate us today. Okay, let me show you a few resources in case you want to pursue this a little bit further. Um, the first one up here is the 12 tales in translation. This has all of those tales I mentioned about the earlier medieval outlaws. It also has a prose version of the Jest of Robin Hood, probably the most important of the medieval texts. The second item there is an edition of all of the Robin Hood material in the original spelling. So it's not in modern English. It is, however, highly glossed. It's a version that I do use in class. By the way, that version is also available free online at the next entry, which is the Robinhood Project. The Robinhood Project is a compendium of online sources that is kept at the University of Rochester. And finally, if you'd like to pursue this further and read an academic account, probably the most accessible is Stephen Knight's Robin Hood, a Mythic Biography, where he goes through the figure from its very opening, earliest appearances in English literature right up until his latest film appearance. Well, thank you very much for listening. If you do have any questions or would like to learn more about this, feel free to contact me at the email listed above. Thank you and go Eagles.